Hello and welcome. Lovely to see everybody here. Hopefully more will be joining us as this sidebar continues. This is the third week of a 5-week online program that's been run out of NCAD called Aftereffects and Untold Histories. And today's event is really about having a conversation, I guess, as a sidebar kind of format allows. Basically looking at mapping performance practices in Ireland in the 1990s. And we're hopeful that this sidebar format will kind of allow for a more conversational approach to documenting these elusive histories that are performance art in Ireland. So what Kate and I are hopeful of today is that we'll start the conversation with a few questions, and then we encourage everybody to actively participate with any questions or observations that you might have as the conversation rolls out. So firstly, let me introduce Dr. Kate Antosik-Parsons, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at Trinity College Dublin and who has published widely on themes of memory, gender, sexuality and embodiment in contemporary art. In 2019, Kate was commissioned to conduct a 6-month research project that was enabled by NCAD's participation in a European funded project called Our Many Europes. Now this 4-year project was really focusing on the legacies of art and production in the 1990s in Europe. And within the context of that, it was looking at kind of the key moments such as the end of communist rule and the emergence of new technologies and how this kind of created a new sense of globalization. The 4-year project is being run by a confederation called Internationale, and there are 7 major European art institutions that are involved in this project. And then there are a number of I suppose what you would call complementary partners, of which NCAD is one. So NCAD's contribution to this larger Our Many Europes project is what we are here today for the Aftereffects and Untold Histories program. And what we're really looking at is like the politics of performance in the 90s, but also what was happening internationally, both in terms of Ireland and then putting that into kind of a more international perspective, looking at what was going on in Europe and how can we all like merge this together as part of a much broader research context. So as part of then Aftereffects and Untold Histories in 2019, Kate mapped the activity of performance in the 1990s and really looked at where the types of historical information lay because it's spread across different repositories and in different institutions. And based on this preliminary mapping stage, then Kate conducted a series of very detailed, in-depth interviews, 11 in total, with Irish artists who were either involved with Irish art in the 1990s and had since moved abroad, or who are still based in Ireland. What emerges from the interviews when you look at them as a whole are some themes around like post-conflict politics, the body, collaboration and artist-led participation and activity. And so some of you may have seen already, or if not, maybe afterwards you could go onto the website and see the excerpts from the interviews that have been published on the website. And then also the full interviews are available to view in NIVAL by research or by appointment only. So Kate, with that kind of very brief introduction to where this project sits, how it emerged, where it sits within the overall theme of Our Many Europes, and then what it aims to do in terms of the Aftereffects and Untold Histories program, it might be useful to kind of wind back to the very beginning of the project back in 2019 and look at the research process. I suppose you're already aware, but for some of you who don't know NIVAL, it's NIVAL, but it's known as the National Irish Visual Arts Library. And so in that sense, by foregrounding library in our title, we're really trying to emphasize that we're a repository with access. And so while libraries may collect like published materials, we're also an archive in the sense that we have a lot of special collections or rare documents that wouldn't otherwise be seen. And so I'm interested to hear your thoughts of how you approached a lot of the special collections in NIVAL, You know, how long did it take? How did you get your head around all the stuff, let's say, for want of a better word, that is in NIVAL? Because I know that it's kind of no, you know, small task, really.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose at the start of the project, really what I did was, just given my kind of research interests, I already had kind of a basic knowledge of who were some of these kind of major figures that we're always looking to for performance art in Ireland. And while I was aware of these people and I've looked at their work, I was kind of thinking, okay, you know, I'm not looking to construct a kind of definitive history here. I'm looking for where we might have kind of gaps in our knowledge. And so I suppose when I came to the project and I started, I did look across, you know, a lot of different collections, but I started with NIVAL, and that's really the first place where I started. And at the beginning of the project, I went in and I met with Donna Romano, who is the librarian, the head librarian of NCAD Library, and was formerly, am I understanding this right, the administrator of NIVAL? Is that correct?
Yep, before me. Yep, yep.
So I met with Donna and I met with Katie Blackmore, and we sat down and we talked about really, you know, what kind of information, what kind of holdings NIVAL is comprised of. So we could kind of get a sense of where would be a good place for me to start, because sometimes starting is really the hardest. It's hard, you know, hard to take that first step. Where do you take that first step? So we talked about maybe different avenues, different possibilities, and we decided that we would start with the artist files. And I had previously used the artist files before, when I was conducting my PhD research, but that probably would have been in maybe between 2006, 2008, up to 2009. So it had been a while since I had been in NIVAL, and at the time the files were very useful for me, and I knew the artist's files. So I began kind of making initial investigations in there. And what I started doing was just really making a list of all of the kind of people, like mapping major players that I knew, and then people who, you know, maybe I didn't really know so much about their practice, but I saw their names coming up in reviews. I was also simultaneously, I kind of call it a lit review, but constructing my knowledge base around what was in newspaper archives and reading back issues of Circa, which is the, at the time, it was the major art magazine on the island of Ireland, which was basically covering, you know, north, south, all the different practices that were going on. And those reviews are really useful because sometimes it would just be, you know, a couple words that someone was writing about a performance that someone was doing, but it was an avenue of investigation. So
Yeah, certainly.
so I started to compile those as well. And while I was starting with the artist files, I began to see that, okay, there's not really everything that I'm looking for in here. So I would go back and I would liaise with NIVAL staff, like Katie or Eve Parnell. They're all really just so knowledgeable about the collection. So if I went in and I was like, hey, I've never heard of this gallery, don't really know anything about it, do you have anything on it? So then they would help me, you know, oh, yeah, we have this file here for you, or actually it became this, so you're better off searching in this file. And it was that kind of knowledge of the collection, which was just really invaluable to me.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it sounds like it's almost like trying to describe how you find a needle in a haystack sometimes, isn't it? Because you know, while we have our website, which is a kind of our primary finding aid, I think any, you know, user of NIVAL needs a lot of curiosity and commitment to really dig down into the collections, because quite often we would acquire collections and then we would do the work afterwards in terms of creating a finding aid. So I know that, say, for example, you engaged with quite a lot of special collections that maybe didn't necessarily have a list. And so you actually, in the process of your research, you were helping us by maybe reorganizing things as you went through them, or often, you know, just kind of alerting us to the fact that things were misfiled or misplaced. So that's quite interesting in the sense of how this a reciprocity can develop between a researcher and a repository, you know, and I think NIVAL really allows for that to happen. Whereas you know, in comparison to approaching other repositories, maybe more like formal repositories like the National Library of Ireland, there's a much stricter system for how you acquire the materials or identify the materials and then acquire them, isn't there?
There is, and even just in terms of how you access those materials, that particularly with the project collection at the National Library, you can search online. There's, you know, a PDF like 100 pages long of all of what's in the holdings of all of those archival boxes. But you really have to have a good idea of what you're looking for, because when you go in, you can only request a certain amount in a day, and you have to request them in advance. And there are very specific processes that I won't say that, I mean, NIVAL has processes for accessing the material, but they're a little bit different in that I could go in and I could pick someone's brain and say, okay, I'm looking for this, but I'm also looking for this. And in a way, it's like triangulating where the material is.
Yeah, well, I think that's why using the word mapping is so accurate, isn't it, in this sense of what you were aiming to do with this project. When you think about mapping, it's about really putting, you know, some fixed points on a previously undefined or uncharted territory, and then from those points you kind of define wider maybe circuits or terrains. And so this idea of like trying to put something fixed down in a very otherwise elusive terrain, which I think is what performance art is, you know, in terms of the history of it anyway. So that idea of mapping is really important. But I mean, given that, so you didn't just use NIVAL, you also, as you mentioned, consulted the project archives in the National Library, and then some various online, like the records of Catalyst, wasn't that right, online as well?
Yes.
I mean, yeah. So I mean, I'm interested to hear your thoughts after this project, you know, in the sense of how would you characterize the records that are available for studying performance art in Ireland at the moment?
Yeah, well, you know, like I said, you kind of have to know what you're looking for, in the sense that, you know, when I was beginning, I had an idea, and what I was mainly guided by was I was looking for, I kind of used my reference point as artist-led platforms, because a lot of the performance work in the 1990s was happening through these artist-led platforms. It wasn't through big major institutions, you know, it was very much artist-led. And there's that kind of like layer of knowledge around some of these practices that I think you're not getting in the formal documentation sometimes. So it was knowing how to look for these things or find the references, which would then send me on to something else. The other thing that I'm aware of too is how we consider documentation of performance. You know, what is that documentation? And a lot of times the stuff that I was finding in the files might have been, you know, invitations to some of the events, or there might have been reviews, or maybe a brief mention on an artist's CV, but it wasn't necessarily like, it wouldn't have always been something that we think of documentation, like, you know, photographic documentation. Although I obviously in the process did uncover some amazing photographic documentation, which I wouldn't have necessarily been aware of, you know, in those places. For example, when I was searching through that special collection, which is the art source boxes, those are, you know, 7 boxes just of really comprehensive material. And when I mean really comprehensive, I mean like 1 box full of FOSS records, which as I was reading through this stuff, you know, I mean, I like to be pretty systematic and detailed. So I was looking through all of these 7 boxes and I realized, wow, this is really not what I'm looking for here. But it's amazing the level of detail, the information which is collected here, which could be useful, really useful to someone that was looking at maybe, you know, how organizations were existing at this time. And but when I was going through those boxes, then I found some really interesting and I feel very valuable documentation of Brian Connolly and Maurice O'Connell's collaborations together. And they had several collaborations in the 1990s, which to my knowledge haven't been really well documented in terms of, they haven't been written about so much. And finding those photographic, you know, the photographic documentation is just absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like without, you know, NIVAL having been given that material by Obstgrave and then us keeping it, and then you finding that, would we really even know that that event happened, you know? So it's interesting because we'll get back to that later, but that idea of the performance document and how much it tells us about the reality of what was going on. But I think it also highlights the importance of keeping material that may not in itself seem that interesting, you know, like a box of FOSS records, but, you know, while it may not suit the criteria of your research, that's not to say that somebody else won't come along soon and maybe be very interested in those kind of activities that were happening.
Exactly.
So, I mean, that kind of highlights one of the issues for us in terms of ongoing storage of these collections and the management of that, because, you know, we're in that sense obliged to keep a lot of what we take in, and then also to kind of make sure that these, you know, are known about and that people can access them and research them in the future. So that's one of the challenges that archives face, you know.
But at the same time, Jenny, it does make sense though to keep that collection together as a whole, because it's all relevant around the work that Jobstgrave and Emer McNamara, who he was working with at the time, the work that they were doing in Temple Bar, which is really, I mean, it gives the kind of 360 view that you're looking for of, you know, what their kind of overall curatorial aims and goals were. So it is, so, you know, from a historical perspective, even though it wasn't relevant for me in this project, it's still fascinating to see that kind of level of documentation and material.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so you know, this was a 6-month project. You kind of gave over the first 3 months to this embedding yourself in NIVAL and then in other, you know, repositories in Dublin and then online. What happened after? How did you, you know, move from the mapping to the research stage?
Yeah, it was hard because I would have loved to have stayed in the mapping stage for a much longer time. And like you said, you know, how do you make the determination about, you know, what fits in within the remit of the project, and okay, this is how I'm going to make my selection of the artists then. So yeah, so I did stay in the mapping phase for a while, and I then just had to kind of draw a line under it at one stage and say, I've kind of hit all of my major goals that I've set out for myself here, and now I'm going to move into actually making my selection of the artists. And what I did at that stage was I had compiled, so initially I was thinking that I would be interviewing artists, maybe writers and curators who were active during the 1990s. But then I decided to actually just bring the focus back down onto the artists, because so many of the artists were also writing at the time where they were involved in curating events. So it kind of seemed to fit within kind of the confines of what I was looking for. So I think initially I had identified maybe 60 different people.
Wow.
Yeah, I was looking over that today and I was like, wow, 60 different people and probably 20 different festivals, events, or platforms. You know, they could have been a once-off, but a major thing, or they could have been like a regular club night. And so what I began to do was look at those two things and see how they fit together, see who were the people that were kind of overlapping between, you know, between my list of names, these events. And I was also interested in the educational aspect as well, because, you know, part of the thing is how was it developing in the 80s and 90s? And what were, you know, art colleges doing to support these practices at the time? And so that was kind of my other element as well, as I was looking at like what was, say, for example, NCAD's involvement in supporting these practices. So I began to look at the educational element as well. And as it happened, it began to kind of then break down a little bit more into what was going on in Dublin, what was going on in Belfast, what was going on in Cork, what was going on in Limerick. That's kind of how it began to divide itself, I suppose, between all of those things I was looking at. So I drew up my short list then, and I was trying to have a mix of people that were working with kind of straight performance practices as we would know it, and then people who were working with sound but overlapping with performance, or you know, maybe working in video, but again, there was a very much performance, you know, kind of bent to it. And I didn't want to try and define performance art as anything really narrow. So I was keeping it quite broad, and I thought it would be good to have a number of different people, either who had, you know, had supported through education or through these platforms, and maybe crossed over with each other in some way. And I think,
I mean, it's funny when you read the interviews, they're full of these fascinating insights that, you know, you wouldn't necessarily get from reading an essay in a published book. It's really those kind of those nuances that sits between the facts, you know, of how events were planned, you know, what types of friendships were formed and how they were sustained and how then this led to new opportunities. Yeah, I think it was it in Brian Connolly recounts how an invitation to Arthur Tiber from Poland over to Northern Ireland then led to a reciprocal performance in Poland where they met Władysław Kazimierczak, and then that in turn led to events such as Irish Days and Castle of Imagination. So it's really interesting to kind of, you know, piece out how all these connections were formed in a very kind of convivial history almost, you know, not something that's not in the books, but that's just there between people. And so I wonder, is this something, you know, that you aimed to capture when you structured your interviews? Or maybe in other words, a better way of thinking about it is, how structured were your interviews? Did you kind of have a few points when you went in and then see where it led you and what kind of fascinating insights would happen or emerge through the conversation?
Yeah, I think they were semi-structured in the sense that what I did beforehand was when I had selected the people I was going to interview, I had drawn up kind of a list of what I understood as their major works during that period, or works that I was interested in hearing more about, and what sort of activities they were engaged in. And so, because I'm aware that there's also this, like, you know, obviously this gap in time period between then and now, that for some people, I mean, I can barely remember sometimes what's going on last week. So for some people, I'm aware that you might need a little bit of a memory jog. And it was funny to see then some people go, oh yeah, I actually forgot I was doing this, and slipping back into what was happening in the 90s, because I was really keen to get this sense of not just what was going on within the kind of art practices, but then how was that reflecting, obviously, as performance does so well, the wider societal political concerns of what's going on in the culture at the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, so when I was interviewing people, I was really keen to try and capture, again, those things which I feel just aren't really spoken about as much, and to try and, you know, almost reflecting the mapping process. How could I then have them reflect on the work that they were doing and kind of talk us around, you know, what was the spirit of performance at the time?
Yeah, I mean, what was interesting for me, say with Brian Connolly, I think it was when you kind of proposed that idea to him that, you know, artists were part of this wider culture. I think he said something, you know, that maybe there was this idea of, you know, traveling and meeting new people was like a generative collaboration, you know, in that, like, this experience of going abroad and being exposed to new types of performance in Poland. And then artists would come back and they'd have so much to chew on, I think was one of the phrases that they used. And it kind of highlighted to me that actually with historical reflection, then artists maybe look back on their own practices slightly differently. So while they were doing it at the time and it was in the moment, and maybe they didn't see it as part of this kind of wider cultural engagement, when we look now and we actually try and map out all these connections and you know, things that were happening to support the practice through artist-led activity, or, you know, the emergence of travel grants, for instance, and the foundation of Art Flight. You know, all these things kind of sustained a new type of cultural mobility, didn't it, yes, for performance art at the time. And so now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can maybe take a more overview approach. But, you know, for artists living at the time and living through it, maybe it was different, you know, when they were perceiving it.
Yeah, and actually, just to touch on something you were saying there, when I was speaking, well, when I was interviewing Anne Seagrave, and I asked her about Art Flight, because I had noticed from her CV that she had gotten a lot of funding from these Art Flight schemes. And she was then reflecting that it was her practice at the time to make performances which were totally portable. So if an invitation came up, or if she was, you know, if she was traveling somewhere, she could just take the performance and go. And that was it. And for her, you know, especially that level of international travel, like she was doing residencies, I think in Canada, and she was over in the States. She was, you know, working over in the UK, continental Europe, all of those, you know, that richness of that travel was really so important for her. And that's like, when she reflects back now on that, again, it's being able to travel to many places and make work and meet all of those new connections and new people and ideas. That's really been so crucial for her within her performance practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's think for a moment about, because there were a lot of Irish artists moving around at the time, particularly performance artists. And, a lot of them were going to Poland or had these kind of connections with Polish artists. And one of the things that came up in the interviews was this idea of, like Irish performance art in comparison to what was being produced in Poland. And I'd like to kind of draw that out a little bit more, because I don't know if much work has been done on it, but it's certainly significant in the interviews in terms of what you got out of reflections from like Sean Taylor, for example, and Brian Connolly mentions it as well. And so does Danny McCarthy. So like of the 11 interviews, that it comes up 3 times in different interviews, and maybe more. I don't know. I'm just thinking of, from what I can recall going through them.
Yeah.
But I mean, so was it, who was it? Was it Sean Taylor was saying, that there was this kind of great sense of danger in Polish performance art at the time, that, Irish artists were really kind of impressed by how they were pushing the envelope so close, that you never really knew what was going to happen next. And then he draws analogies between what was happening in Poland and in Ireland, and particularly, differences between art in Northern Ireland and then what was happening in the Republic. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was interesting to hear Sean's reflection, because again, Sean would have been an artist that wouldn't have necessarily been on my radar before this project. So when I saw that he was at the time, he was working on this collaboration with Amanda Dunsmore and Richard Creasy, and they were doing they were performing a STEM, so this collaborative performance. And for them, Sean said that going to Poland was really vital, because it was just like opening up all of these new possibilities of things. And he had previously studied under Alistair MacLennan in the 1980s, but at that time, performance wasn't kind of so much of a thing for him. It then became later important in his practice in the 1990s. And he spoke very eloquently about looking at the kind of different types of performance that was going on, say, like in the Republic, maybe that more kind of like Boycean inflected performance. And then in the North, something that was kind of more of I think he called it like, a polite risk or something. Whereas then when he was going over to Poland and seeing some of the performances over there, he was saying, like, he actually said, you weren't sure was someone going to die, because it was like very extreme. And it was really formative for him in terms of then what he was looking to do. So that was really fascinating just to hear that, and to just get that insight into, again, something which really hasn't been, I think, I know it's been identified, but I don't feel like it's really been written about as much.
No, I don't think so either. And I think actually, from reading through all of the interviews, one of your key takeaways from this process should be that idea, and I do think it merits more investigation, and because it's, as you say, it's something that's been acknowledged in Irish art historiography, but not much has been done about it, and maybe there's more there, that needs kind of drilling down into. Absolutely. It would be really interesting to ask artists more specifically just about that, and maybe Alistair MacLennan as well. I mean, you had reasons for not interviewing him as part of this. But, if there were to be kind of a second round, it would be really interesting to hear what he would have to say about that, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was one of the hard decisions for me, because, I mean, like, Alistair is just such a force to be reckoned with, in performance, and has been for so long. But I'm aware that there is a lot of stuff that has been written about him. And there's a book which is coming out actually in September, which is edited by Sandra Johnston, Sherry Driver, and Paula Blair. And I know it's going to be really comprehensively looking at his practice. And there are some interviews in there, I think, as well. So I was a little bit like, I was kind of, really, it was a hard decision not to include him. But I was thinking, what, there are other ways in which I can kind of map these interconnections, because there were so many people that I spoke with for whom Alistair was just such a formative figure. Anne Seagrave, Sandra Johnson, Sean Taylor, Brian Connolly. I mean, it's just so many. Fergus Byrne, like, it was quite incredible.
Yeah, and it's wonderful now that Alistair's archive has been digitized and is available through the University of Dundee website, because I just think it's going to lead to so much more fascinating research now that his images are much more widely available, and then all of that type of I suppose preliminary documentation, and is available, that the type of ephemera that we would have in NIVAL as well, but now that that's available online through his own personal collection, I think it's a really great move, but actually thinking about the idea of the performance document, because you kind of referenced that earlier when you were talking, maybe we could just talk a little bit about that. How do you characterize a document of performance art? Because, say, for example, a lot of the material that we would have in NIVAL would be the ephemera that's produced in advance of a performance. Mm-hmm. So the posters and the flyers and the press releases, that kind of thing. So at the time of their production, they were produced in anticipation of the event, but now they form a record of what we assume to have happened. And then the other side of the type of documentation we would have would be the photographs. But, what emerged from your interviews quite often was that artists kind of, either didn't have the means to photograph their work very well, or they were relying on college students or friends in the audience to take a few snapshots. And so there was kind of, it was cost prohibitive, but then it was also just due to lack of access to those type of technologies at the time. So, we've got these two types of document. We've got the maybe the ante-document, for want of a better word, that which was produced in advance of the event, and then the actual document as record. Well, what are your thoughts on how, when the artists that you interviewed, how they viewed documenting their performance at the time?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, like you said, photographic documentation was sometimes out of reach, like, as people now conceive of documentation in today's kind of practices. Back then it seemed a little bit out of reach for people in terms of availability of cameras, or, someone might take one photograph of performance and that's basically what, exists as a kind of record, I suppose. And some people are happy with that. Some people are, totally fine with that. So it is interesting to see how different artists either document their performance, or like, that's why I was asking, when I was speaking with Fergus Byrne, I was asking him about his writing practice, because Fergus just has an amazing, amazing memory. And he was at so many performance events in the 1990s that you could talk to him basically about any artist, and he would have something really interesting, a really interesting kind of recollection of Andre Stitt, or his first time seeing someone, that was just so crucial for him. So I was asking him then, well, what about your writing practice? Because writing could also be seen as a form of documentation. And he was kind of saying, oh, well, this isn't necessarily something I've engaged in so much because I feel it's a little bit of navel gazing. But I know for other people, it would be quite important to keep notebooks, or I know Danny McCarthy was talking about these performance notebooks that he keeps. And I was asking him, are they like artist books or what are they? And he's like, no, these are specific to performances where I would kind of keep notes about what I wanted to do, think of titles, and that he would have one for nearly every performance. And again, that is like, to me, that was totally mind blowing, because I was thinking of, as a researcher, oh my God, I would love to see these. This just sounds amazing. And I would hope that that these will someday make their way into the NIVAL collection. That would be fantastic, for future research. But again, to try and think about what are other forms of documentation, and how can researchers or artists who are interested in these practices engage with that. That's kind of something that I was thinking all along during this project. And actually, when I was interviewing Frances Mazzetti, Frances in 2008 had done a performance, actually, which concerned my husband's great aunt. And it was totally random, and I didn't know that his great aunt was involved in this performance at all. She was in a nursing home in Clontarf, and Frances knew her, and there was a kind of like mapping type history mapping project that she did with her about like her life narrative. And when I went to see Frances actually had documentation from the performance, which was this like net curtain that she had drawn this portrait of my husband's aunt on, and she gave it to me. And actually afterwards, I had like this little mini performance of my own where I was like looking at these photographs and the histories and the curtain, and kind of doing this thing where then I was looking at my children because there are similarities between them. And I was thinking, this is a different way of engaging with performance documentation. You know, this isn't maybe necessarily a way that we would think of, you know, as kind of traditional art history about how we write about something from the past, but it was bringing something from the past into the present. And it got me thinking about, you know, what are the different ways in which we can engage with performance that happened in the past in the present. And that's where I think that, you know, there's still a lot of possibilities for how we think about documentation, and what serves as documentation just doesn't necessarily have to be a still photograph, you know, or a video. It can be something completely different. So, you know, hopefully that's just even like a point that I think would be very valuable in terms of like for people looking to conduct future research around this area, is thinking about, you know, the status of documentation and maybe trying to tease out a little bit more like what else exists out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting to consider, following on from that point, you know, how do we capture the intangible elements of a performance? Because so much performance, you know, involves sound or smell or material products that can't necessarily be housed in an archive. And so I was interested to ask you about whether you chose oral history as a specific methodology that could somehow kind of capture these intangible heritages of performance through artists revisiting and talking and kind of, you know, maybe filling in the gaps in what is known about their work. So I think oral history can, you know, it's interesting, isn't it, when you think about performance as something intangible, well, elements of it that can't be like accurately recorded in the complete cycle of a photograph, or, you know, that kind of thing. So was that a conscious decision, the way you chose the interview format?
Yeah, I think it was, and it became evident to me really early on as I was doing the mapping phase that some of the most important things that I was learning or hearing were actually from some of my conversations that I was having informally with people.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had a couple key artists who were working today that I was speaking with, Dominic Thorpe, Helena Walsh, Amanda Coogan, Anya Phillips, Michelle Brown, these people, Elle Putnam. We were just kind of talking about ideas and then talking about performances and talking about different practitioners. And actually some of the stuff that comes up in the conversation is, again, stuff that's not, you know, it's not recorded. And that's what I was really keen to try and capture in the interviews, was, again, these recollections which would just be totally lost, you know, if you weren't kind of drawing them out of someone. But they are so important for understanding our development of these practices during this time period. So that was really an important part for me. And another thing, which kind of, just the way that this happened to fall, but it was a really important talking point, was at the time when I was conducting the interviews, Sandra Johnston had her live performance in Project. The exhibition was, I think it was called Wait It Out. And this had been specially commissioned for Project, and there was like a video installation, but there was a live performance. And up until this point, I had never seen Sandra perform live. It just hadn't been something that had happened, unfortunately. And I was totally blown away by it. It was just this really incredibly emotive performance that like actually shook me for days afterwards. I just wasn't right after it. It was so affective. And when I was, this was around the time I was conducting the interviews, and there were several people who were actually in the audience who I was interviewing or who I had informal conversations with. And it was nearly like a talking point in itself about that kind of in the moment performance, and reflecting on, again, why that live element is really so, you know, still so important. And again, so even just, it happened totally by chance, but the fact that there were lots of people that were at the opening of the exhibition, that's when I met Fergus Kelly. We were able to reflect back on this idea of smell in performance, or that, you know, like you said, the intangible. And so that element to it was, I mean, it was serendipitous, but it was so important with the oral histories.
Yeah, I think so. And actually we're, you know, I've been to a few events where live performance has been presented alongside more traditional means of showing documentation from an archive. So where you might have, you know, ephemera in vitrines, or posters hung on a wall, that kind of thing, or even, you know, a rolling loop of video art in a screening, you know, in a separate room. But what stands out most for me is the live performance, you know, on the opening night. I'm thinking of Dominic Thorpe in particular at IMA in 2015 when NIVAL had its mobile encounter show that looked at documents of performance art from the early days. And, you know, even though Dominic, you know, is a later generation to the type of work that was being looked at in the exhibition, his live performance just really brought a new kind of understanding, I think, to everybody in the room of what the potential was in the documents that were on display, because they weren't just static representations anymore. You know, they actually meant something because they kind of related to this experience that they had just witnessed. So yeah, as you say, finding new ways, I think, of presenting and kind of interweaving the live element with then this kind of consciousness towards documenting as much as we can, maybe in new ways. Histories of performance are so important, aren't they, as we kind of move forward in this project of writing history of Irish art, Irish performance art in particular.
Yeah, definitely. And that's certainly something I'm really interested in at the moment is, you know, from the kind of writer's perspective, getting inside the performance nearly. You know, how do you write about a performance as it's being developed or happening? And that's a project that I'm currently engaged in. But it's again trying to shift our perception of, you know, this is kind of a discrete, this is like this little tiny entity of performance and it's there, and then we write about it. But it's actually something that spills across all of these boundaries. And how do we get inside that? You know, how can we know more about those processes and what goes on in the development, you know, from start to finish? And then you end up, you know, not necessarily you end up with a live project, that it's a process. And how do we really get under the hood of that is something I'm really interested in at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, it might be a good opportunity to ask if anybody else has questions, anyone else in the room, considering some of the themes that we've been exploring. We're looking at a lot of blank screens, so it's hard to imagine what you look like behind your videos. But if you do have any questions, hop on your mic and just fire away.
Hi.
Hi, Emma.
Hi, Kate, is it okay if I ask you a question?
Of course, yeah.
I'm just really interested in what you were talking about there about kind of those like in-between conversations that almost like happen outside of the interview, or that they're almost so like inherent to the work, but they're not usually documented. And I think that that's like really interesting and something that I'm always trying to like capture as well when I'm speaking to people or talking about my work. Now that you've talked to these people in that way and you've had those kind of like external conversations almost, can you see it in the work? Or do you think it changes how you see the work?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know if it changes how I see the work. It certainly reaffirms to me the importance of like performance artists being involved in writing their own histories, because there's so much richness there that I just feel like it's, you know, I don't know if it needs to be captured, but it's hard to kind of get at. But some of the conversations I've had around performance, the informal conversations, have been things which, yeah, in a way are nearly completely mind-blowing. But again, it's like, how do I take this information that someone's just given to me and shared with me informally and bring this into my understanding of, yeah, I mean, it's something I'm really grappling with. But I definitely think, again, it's within the conversation. It's within, you know, it's not one person coming up with an idea. It's that these ideas, just like in performance, are, you know, are that engagement between spectator and witness and artist, or however that relationship is structured, that it is very much in flux and kind of constantly developing and moving. And that's something which is just so intriguing to me. That's, you know, it just trying to constantly grab onto that, I think, when you're writing about performance. Yeah, I don't know if that, I don't know if that's kind of.
That's good. Thank you. No, because I make performance work, and I always find those conversations or the beauty in those conversations, and then there's like this like pressure. It's like, do I need to include that in my work? Is it saying it already? Does that need to be like, clocked somewhere, or does it just kind of do that anyway by like just keeping open and involved? And so it's interesting to hear that from a researcher point of view. Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Great. Any other questions out there? Well, we've got a question from Sean here. Thanks, Kate. Did you encounter any documentation of the public's response in your research?
That's a good question. Let me think about this here. I'm just thinking in particular when I was, I don't know if I encountered documentation of it, but in one of the interviews I was doing with Fergus Kelly, Fergus was talking about this, it was an early performance installation that he did. I think it was in Temple Bar Galleries. It was like in 1989, and it was called Manufacture. And it was this kind of like post-industrial type installation where you went in, and he was talking about that it had been reviewed by 2 different critics. I think one was Aidan Dunn, and the other I think was Des McAfcock, who would have been more of a kind of more, I'm trying to place him quite within criticism. Maybe you know Jenny better than I do, but more kind of traditional critic. I mean, not not Brian Fallon type traditional, but
exactly.
But maybe not as into some of the contemporary works as Aidan Dunn in a certain way. The more time-based works. And Fergus was talking about how the difference in the 2 reviews that he got. One was like, "Oh, this is brilliant, this is great," and then the other one was like, "What the hell is this?" It was just like so like not. He just couldn't engage with it. And actually, that takes me back to something that Fergus was saying about when he was studying in Dunleary at the time, that there wasn't a lot of support for the practice. He felt like he did have some interactions with James Coleman, which were really valuable to him. But again, it was that lack of support that he was getting. And, it was almost like sometimes I think people need to kind of form communities. Sorry, I'm talking around your question here, but part of those communities are also that kind of like public response as well, how that feeds back into or folds into the practice or the work. So yeah, trying to think of any other instances.
I think it's always fascinating to go through the letters to the editor, newspaper clippings in the files and NIVAL.
Oh yeah.
Because you often find the most vitriolic criticism of particularly kind of, experimental art practices. Or I think I came across one time addressed to Dorothy Walker, who was an art historian and curator and mover shaper in Irish art in the 1970s and 80s. And she was involved in the various Rosk exhibitions, and somebody had kind of sent a very mean letter to the editor about Dorothy Walker's I don't know, selection or something. And she wrote back another letter to the editor, kind of stating that she was a married Catholic mother of 5 children, practicing Christian with an interest in, Irish contemporary forms of Irish art. And in no way did she see that this was, I can't really remember the wording now, but it was just really interesting to, see this exchange that was going on in a very public sphere between, a critic or I suppose within the Irish Times, but like just between a curator and a critic and a member of the public, and the spat that was taking place.
I think I'm just thinking back around that time period too. I think it was maybe 72 or so, or maybe a little bit later, when Joseph Boyce and the blackboards in the Hugh Lane, and there was that whole hullabaloo going on about what is this? Is this even art? And again, those conceptual practices really challenging people's perceptions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm just thinking in Fergus Burns' interview, he did, and this is the excerpt that I selected for the publication, was he was talking about this performance that he did in front of Central Bank, where he walks up in front of Central Bank and he realizes that there's this huge crowd surrounding him, and the guard actually halts the performance because he's like, "Are you okay there? What's going on?" And he was like, people were getting rowdy and someone was going to try something against him. And again, this idea of like when performance is in a public place like that, and there are a lot of, you know, uncertainties about what's going on, what's the meaning of this, what's happening, you know, that there is that element of chance where, you know, a member of the public could engage with you in a way that you don't expect or that you don't want.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Yeah, it's fascinating. Was there, Bernadette, did you have a question or no?
Yeah, I was just going to comment sort of on what you were saying. I'm sorry, I'm sitting here in the dark, so it was very sunny and now it's got dark. No, I think a lot of the work originally was outside of the gallery space for that particular reason, that it was outside of the institutions, the gatekeepers, and you know, like Boyce, you know, was really trying to start a social movement with performance art that sort of the establishment didn't really want to know about, I think. And there's still a bit of that. I mean, I work with Beyond and also with James King in Derry, and there's still a bit of that, you know, within the establishment of, you know, the art world, that it's kind of, you know, because we decide when we're going to do a performance, we can do it on a street, we can do it anywhere, that there's a little bit of it still working outside of that space. It's a different space and it's a more democratic space. And it also, you know, really reflects on sort of stuff that's going on, you know, that's maybe anti-establishment as well. So it has all that potential, very rich kind of space to work in, I think, and very freeing for an artist to work in that space, you know. And that's why I suppose a lot of it wasn't documented either, because, you know, back, I suppose, in earlier times, to document stuff like that, technologically, you know, it was quite expensive as well. So that wasn't possible for artists working in that space at that time. But a lot of artists I know have kept remnants of their performances. So maybe, you know, when you think about if you wanting to kind of look at that sort of as a way of preserving, maybe that's, that you mentioned the curtain, Kate, and maybe that's sort of alternative type of library, performance library, don't know. But you know, I've really enjoyed listening to all the research that you did, and yeah, the commentary that's happening here.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Bernadette. Yeah, I mean, that came up as well, didn't it? The idea of, you know, performance artists actively choosing that means of engagement because it sat outside of institutional frameworks, and then that they have to sustain their performance practices through these artist-led activities because the supports weren't there otherwise. You know, there was little funding, there was little opportunity for a gallery to collect, you know, whatever residue of your work remained after the live event. And so I think performance artists have always kind of worked outside of these institutional frameworks, maybe less. Yeah, Bernadette, you're saying that that's still happening, but, you know, now we're starting to see places like IMAR actively collecting historical performance art. So that is a really positive move, you know, from a national cultural institution to acknowledge the need to start actively collecting performance, whatever document or trace of it remains. But I think back in the 90s and 80s, you know, artists were actively working outside of those kind of structures.
Yeah, it is interesting because that's something that Anne Seagrave again spoke about. Was for her, it was very, you know, anti-establishment, you know, anti-art market. That's what performance was. It was completely, you know, total anathema to those things. And she was saying that, you know, when she was reflecting on what her life was like at the time, she was saying, you know, it was kind of miserable. You know, we were really poor. We just did things on a shoestring budget. But a key thing for her was that building of the community. And like you were saying, Bernadette, with Be Beyond, like that idea of very democratically led space, people meeting together and having those kind of regular performances And some of the stuff that Anne was doing at the time, and she would have been very influenced by Alistair's work, was, again, you know, she was a really good organizer, and she was able to put these things together very quickly and get people to pitch in, and it was a needs must type thing. And they were fantastic. I mean, now, were they captured for posterity, or, you know, no, probably not. But these are things that do seem to live on in the histories, particularly when I was talking with people, they'd be like, oh, Anne Seagrave, brilliant organizer. Like, anything I went to that she put on was just amazing, great performances. You felt really welcome. It was really inclusive. So again, those, you know, our questions are, what are the ways, or how do we value those activities? You know, because we don't maybe have the evidence base, or the, you know, we have some ephemera from them, but it's these things that live on in the memories of people, and they were important to the engagement with, you know, the politics at the time, and to the development of the practices.
Yeah, that's a good point. And maybe, and it's a good point to kind of end on as well, in the sense of, you know, this idea of being very timely. So, you know, a lot of artists are still alive and actively practicing, and the ones that you interviewed have a lot of wonderful recollections of the time. But in the sense of it being like a living history, and one that's particularly suited to oral histories, what are your plans for the future, or could you see any potential new research outputs from this project that you conducted?
Well, I mean, I have to say, it was absolutely thrilling to speak to people. So would I love to do more? Yes, I absolutely would. You know, I absolutely love talking to people about performance and picking people's brains. In terms of kind of future outputs, I mean, I really hope that this would be a starting point for people, that people would be able to come and to look at the interviews, and to, I mean, they're so kind of rich in terms of the thematics around collaborations. That's, I feel, a really under-researched area of performance art here in Ireland, is the kind of collaborative nature. And, you know, maybe looking at key collaborations, I'd love to see some kind of research around that. You know, again, I'm really interested in the gender and sexuality dimension to it. And sexuality was something that didn't come through as much as I was hoping it would, but it's so ripe for the, you know, the eager researcher there, or, you know, an artist to kind of look at what was going on during those time periods. I think Hannah Tiernan is looking at around queer performance, if I'm recalling correctly. I think she was a master's student at NCAD in the art and modern world, or contemporary world program. But I mean, yeah, like, in terms of what's to come, I mean, you know, I'd love to be able to continue stuff like this forever if I could, just because it's just so intriguing, that there's so many different layers to it, you know, that I really hope that people will see this as a starting point and an impetus for their own curiosities and investigations into the area.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, you know, these are a starting point, and I guess they're a wonderful primary research resource that are, you know, where the excerpts are available online, and then you can also come into NIVAL and read through the full interviews in your own time. And maybe do leave a bit of time if you plan on coming in, because they're just so fascinating, and you just want to dive in and like not stop and go through every single one. I think it took me like 3 days to read through all 11 of them, and, you know, really like reflect on them. So it's almost like you've produced a small book in a way. So congratulations on that. Yeah, I mean, just let me see, Andrea, sorry, maybe one more question before we sign up. Really fascinating. I just had a call, so missed 5 minutes, but I'd really like to know the themes running through the 80s and 90s. But I think maybe, Kate, you've already kind of answered that, in the sense of, you know, talking about the artist-led activity, and, you know, the collaboration, the generative space for collaboration that kind of produced new performances, and the travel connections that were formed, those kind of things.
I think one other thing that I didn't really touch on, but is certainly there, is the idea of site-specific performances, because I think that there were really a lot of exciting site-specific work that was going on, specifically around in 1991, when Brian Connolly and others organized available resources. I know that there was a funeral home, a funeral parlor, where some performances took place. And again, just sounds totally fascinating. Would have loved to have been there. So this idea of the kind of the site specific and engaging site in that way through performance was something that came through in a lot of the interviews as well.
Very good. Okay, I think unless anybody has any other questions, we might call it a day there. Kate, thank you so much, both in terms of, you know, your contribution today, but in terms of the project itself. It's just fascinating. As I said, it's wonderful reading, and I do encourage you all to come in to NIVAL, book an appointment and contact me through the website. And yeah, let's hope that this leads to new and exciting adventures in the future.